Thank you all for coming to our presentation today. My name is Brian Aguilar. I'm the Deputy Director for the Center for California Studies. I'm the Director of the Executive Fellows Program. Welcome to our 2019 Visiting Scholar presentation. California is a nation-state, innovative, inevitable. Briefly, we've had the Visiting Scholar Program now for about 7 years, and we routinely bring in professors from throughout the state and a few other states like external as well to bring in and to share their research that we feel is pertinent not only to California as a whole, but to the mission of the Center for California Studies, which is to bridge academia and government in service of strengthening California's democracy. This Visiting Scholar Program is generously supported by the Don and Beverly Birth Fund. Dr. Donald Birth was a president of Sacramento State University for 18 years and was fundamental in the formation of not only the Center for California Studies, but in the stewardship of the Capital Fellows programs, which we host. With that, just some housekeeping items for sure. As for those who arrived already, there's lunch to the side. We have trash cans in the back. There are restrooms immediately to the outside of the doors to your right and to your left that are gender neutral. We'll have our presentation, a short break to throw away trash and stretch a little bit, and then we'll have our panelists come up after that as well. We're going to have a little bit of Q&A after the end of Allison's presentation this morning. But with that, I want to make sure that we get on to our presentation. So our visiting scholar for 2019 is Dr. Allison Holmes. Dr. Holmes is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Humboldt State University for over 8 years. While having been born and raised in Oklahoma, Dr. Holmes has done extensive work in the UK in British politics, successfully holding several positions with the Liberal Democrat Party, including General Election Coordinator and National Campaign Manager. Dr. Holmes has also served as the Deputy Head of Corporate Communication Strategy for the BBC and helped launch BBC News 24 and BBC Online. While serving as a speechwriter for the U.S. Ambassador in London, Dr. Holmes was a teaching and research fellow at the Rothmere American Institute at Oxford and later participated in the Pierre Keller Fellowship in Transatlantic Studies at Yale University. Her research interests involve global diplomacy and California as an increasingly important global actor, British politics, and international relations theory. Dr. Holmes is a graduate of Northwestern University and the University of Chicago, and she earned her PhD from the London School of Economics. So while she's no longer in Illinois or England, we're glad to have her here in California today. Please welcome Dr. Allison Holmes.
Hello. See if I can find where to put my water that it won't fall. See how that works. Right, well, thank you all for coming, and a huge thank you to our panelists who've really given up a lot of time to be here as well, so thank you. I'm honored and humbled that you've come to listen to an out-of-towner, and depending on how you look at it, an out-of-stater to boot. And I have no slides. And Ariel, my clicker. I have a human clicker as well as a mechanical clicker. She's probably better, more reliable. Oh, technology. I love technology. Haha. We good, Ariel? I teach at Humboldt State University, located not only on the traditional lands of the Wiyot people, but also within the increasingly pugnacious state of Jefferson. I mention both today because they're relevant to what I want to talk about, and to what I see as a trend in our current political discourse, namely the increasing connection, or perhaps disconnection, between sovereignty and identity politics, and the tension this creates in terms of governance as California continues to shape its global role. I'm very much looking forward to a fascinating conversation about what I see as this new stage in the process of globalization. California as a nation state is something I've been thinking about for a while, but focused on in the last 12 months, conducting over 60 interviews with diplomats, former governors, as well as with state, national, and tribal officials. But the project's roots really lie in my 20 years of professional experience, mostly in the United Kingdom, that Brian very kindly alluded to in his introduction. Working for the BBC in strategic communications and Burson Marsteller, managing a transatlantic business organization, and running national campaigns for the Liberal Democrats, as well as speechwriting for a US ambassador. When I moved into academe, Ariel, this worked before. I promise it did. When I moved into academic thinks, it seemed natural to bring those worlds together by studying diplomacy, an institution that predates the oldest forms of formal politics as facilitator of the communication of power. I see diplomacy as particularly important today as entities at every level struggle with the effects of globalization on our cohabiting and overlapping identities and communities, be they tribal like the Wiyot or aspirational like the state of Jefferson. More directly, this project is about helping my students connect what they learn in the classroom to the world. Humboldt is a poor, rural community where the industries of forestry and fishing are in long-term decline. We now live in the wild west of marijuana, where previously illegal family farms are trying to move out of the shadows, but are often overwhelmed by out-of-area owners. Local retailers succumb to the deadening reach of Amazon. 10% don't graduate from high school. And the Yurok tribe, also local to Humboldt and one of the largest in the state, has declared a state of emergency in terms of suicide. Humboldt overall has one of the highest suicide rates, and elementary children arrive in school with one of the highest adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs scores, in California. I see Governor Newsom's economic development team has announced a new initiative called Regions Rise Together, designed to address the disparity between the wealthy coast and disadvantaged inland areas. I just hope they remember there's more to the coast than Marin. As someone who studies international relations theory and teaches international studies, I'm fascinated by the attraction people have to what they understand to be sovereignty and how they use such claims as the basis for local and identity politics. But as an educator and a community member, I'm concerned about the divisiveness such fragmentation could create, and I worry that Humboldt is a little too proud of being the lost coast or behind the redwood curtain, privileging what they perceive to be the local over the global, to the point of seeking to disconnect from rather than engage with the world outside. And yet, as a relentlessly optimistic pragmatist, I believe that a holistic, integrated, and what I call a truly global approach could help mitigate these dangers and be the foundation of California's future. Those are the academic, philosophical, and normative reasons I'm trying to understand California's increasingly international profile. But the title of my talk is a little more academic, so first I will talk about California as a nation state, and second I'll talk about whether this approach is a funky California innovation or a phenomenon that was somehow inevitable as the next stage of globalization. I know you're a busy people, so I will give you the typically academic answer to the title question up front. It's a bit of both. That we are becoming more international looks inevitable. How we go about this process has plenty of potential to be innovative, but that is not a given and could equally turn into far less desirable adjectives. I'll conclude by offering some ideas about how we might avoid that outcome. When Governor Davis called California a nation state at a lunch for Mexican President Zedillo in 1999, relatively few people noticed. When Governor Schwarzenegger called California a nation state, some people rolled their eyes that the governator was putting on airs and graces. As it happens, both governors, Republican and Democrat, correctly identified a trend that has only become more pronounced. 20 years on, people are again talking about California as a nation state, but we still haven't really worked out what it means. Of course, political scientists can be very fussy about terminology, and their problem with this assertion is a nation is supposed to be based on something essential, like language or ethnicity or religion. Just being the folks who live on one part of the west coast of a continent in the northern hemisphere is not really nation-state worthy. Still, and to call on the party of California, or to use Governor Newsom's language, a California for all, is to assert a special kind of nation, one that is peculiarly American, a nation that is self-created and rooted in one of the most basic of all American myths, a melting pot with boundless ability to create unity from diversity. According to the Public Policy Institute of California, 27% of the state's population are foreign-born, more than double the national average. Personally, I'm another Okie who came to California relatively recently, but as the daughter of a geologist, I also bring a slightly different sense of what constitutes a long time. So I would like to pose the potentially contentious assertion that 100% of Californians are foreign in some sense. It depends on how far back you go. For the last, call it 13,000 years, a mere pittance for a geologist, people from every point on the compass have left poor hunting, disaster, disease and hunger, poverty and oppression, genocide, jihad, and plain old-fashioned wars of religion to be in this place. Moreover, once they arrived, every group, every people, every nation without exception has jostled, fought, and killed for territory and power in the pursuit of survival and their own vision of prosperity and progress. So I would argue that every person living in the state today has a share and a stake in this long view of time, because we live with the legacy, the benefits, and the wounds of our shared and very global story every day. Yet what we see as we enter this era of post-sovereign globalization is a politics of local identity in place that has jumped a level to reach the global stage. An emerging characteristic of globality, therefore, seems to be a simultaneity of the local and the global, and a leveraging of levels as each group pushes their own agenda up or down to make gains along this increasingly interconnected system. Looking around the world, we can see this kind of politics is volatile and can be as violent as it is transformative. As such, it holds perils as well as opportunities for governance in California. As mentioned, over the past 12 months, I've conducted interviews here in Sacramento and in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, including contacts with Governors Wilson, Schwarzenegger, and Brown, and I attended the Global Climate Change Summit last September as a journalist and the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Forum in New York in April as an observer. Without exception, every conversation has been fascinating as diplomats, state and city officials, national organizations representing cities, counties, and development organizations talked about how all these entities, foreign and domestic, are engaged in a new and global conversation in and with California. What I've learned is that in California, what we academics call subnational diplomacy, or an even fancier term, paradiplomacy, is vital and vibrant, though still chaotic and often unfocused. California makes an excellent case study for what I call the vertical axis of diplomacy, and the sovereignties that exist within and above our state. The vertical is also useful because it offers a contrast to the more traditional chronological timeline of state development and helps frame this conversation as an intentionally sharp critique of more Western Eurocentric ideas with assumed hierarchies of power and structure. Scholars have struggled with the impact of globalization on the state and diplomacy and offered terms such as networked, multi-level, multi-layered, or even polycentric diplomacy to explain the outcome. Others have grappled with the question of how California connects to the world. Abe Lowenthal and Mark Baldassare span the academic policy divide, and both have called on California to embrace its global potential. However, relatively few people have tried to tackle what this process looks like in a specific time and place to a particular entity. So I decided to try and take a local global look out my own front door and examine the way globalization affects California's diplomacy. I wanted to know how the state reaches out to the world, and crucially, how the world out there sees and interacts with the state. That meant I needed to fundamentally shift the traditional horizontal axis to get more of a vertical view, a core sample, if you will. What we see is that over the years, the state has made great progress. The governors all presented a strong case, though framed very differently, for their international credentials in terms of trade and investment or the environment. Governor Newsom, in his first 100 days, has made a trip to El Salvador, not for the self-interested reason of economics, but as a fact-finding mission on immigration. He's also added international affairs to the trade and investment portfolio of his lieutenant governor, but more on those later. The immediate challenge is the simple fact that whatever the rhetorical language, the political scientists' formal definition of nation-state wins out, because California does not qualify. We are a state within a federal union specifically and constitutionally prohibited from engaging in foreign affairs, at least to the extent that California can't make treaties. States' rights are at the heart of a new war with Washington, and Californians have a front row seat for the escalating fight as this issue shifts from the right to the left of the political spectrum. I hesitate to quote supporters of the state of Jefferson, but they make an interesting point when they accuse Sacramento of illegal interaction with foreign powers and pushing its constitutional remit. As one diplomat asked, discussing California's MOUs on climate change, when is a treaty not a treaty? The answer is, when the deal is done by a subnational without the formal authority to make a treaty, but with the power and the determination to make it stick. A point that begs much larger issues. When as a sovereign, not have sovereignty? At what point do state relations at the international level become a foreign policy? My point here is that our traditional ideas of sovereignty are ill-equipped to describe what we see in the real world. Writers such as Stephen Krasner have talked about different types of sovereignty as they seek to expand the idea of the state beyond its traditional territorially bounded confines, or what we international relations folks call the Westphalian model. Others have suggested quasi-sovereignty or plurinational democracy to explain the erosion of traditional sovereignty, and made a case for the inclusion of other sub- and supranational entities. However, it is rare to find an international relations folk who has tried to square the ideas of traditional sovereignty, albeit compromised, with a very different and ancient concept of inherent sovereignty, as understood and used by Native Americans and other indigenous groups. Though Kevin Brunel comes to mind with what he calls the third space of sovereignty. The result is a conundrum of theory and practical politics, where the word sovereignty is used in entirely different ways, depending on whether we are talking about entities within the state or beyond our borders, about the mainstream traditional nation state or unrecognized and often marginalized entities. Surely if the processes of globalization that have created this conceptual traffic jam are to be useful, they will force us to reconcile the concepts we use across levels of governance and create a more nuanced understanding of what it is to be domestic or foreign in a global age. I want to spend a moment at this intersection of traditional inherent sovereignty because I believe it has implications for all subnational and global interactions. In terms of California's approach and whatever the state has done in terms of tribal communities in the past, California now acts on the policy of government-to-government relations with its 109 recognized and 60 unrecognized tribes. Governor Newsom's apology last June is also a significant step in this process. As to the federal government's approach, we could have a long discussion about the different phases in Native American policy. The real issues arising from California's Spanish past and the fact that California was established largely after the federal government stopped making treaties with tribes, which means their sovereignty or self-determination relies far more on executive orders and legislation than on treaties or the constitutional frame developed in the earliest period of colonial history. Whatever the evolution, the end result is that California tribes look to this concept of inherent sovereignty, which, contrary to international relations theory, argues that sovereignty requires no outside recognition and is based entirely on an assertion by its own people. I hope you can hear the grinding of gears as the political understandings and activities at one level do not and cannot easily shift to other levels, as entities and actors try to operate with entirely different understandings of their role and power. The myths we have told ourselves for centuries as to the dominance of traditional statehood and sovereignty have broken down, accelerated by globalization. And the current unraveling of that overarching narrative, combined with demands for global identity and personality by subnational actors who have not to date even been recognized in the international space, could either be a point of serious conflict, or we could take it as an opportunity for a new understanding of sovereignty. All of which is a prelude to the question I have posed as to the inevitability or innovativeness of California's global position. To answer that question, I want to share 3 observations based on what I've learned from my conversations. My primary focus was on the consuls general from countries with whom California has large trading relationships and agreements or memorandums of understanding. This included interviews with consul generals, their deputies, or other officers from Mexico, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, India, Japan, Australia, they're all there. I tried to include multiple interviewees from each country, and then added a brief written survey of other countries to extend my reach. I later added the Dean of the Consular Corps and the Office of Foreign Missions in Los Angeles, and further afield, I interviewed a number of diplomats in Washington, D.C., though there I focused my efforts on Canada, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. When in Washington, I also sought out the organizations considered to be in the Big Seven. Christened by President Clinton, these groups represent subnationals such as governors, counties, cities, and state economic development entities. In terms of tribal issues, I interviewed people here in California and in Washington and attended the UN Indigenous Peoples Forum. I was humbled by the willingness of people to share their insights and experience, and those conversations have literally enabled me to be here. But the real question is, what did I learn about California? First, for all the hype and California's desire not only to be a leader but an innovator, our subnational activity is not original. As with all trends, there are cycles, and so while one could argue we have seen an uptick in subnational activity, what California has done and is doing is not altogether novel. I can already hear you protesting that the environmental movement with strong leadership from California has created network after network on the existential issue of climate change. My reply is essentially that while this may reflect a new enthusiasm, particularly here in the United States, as we became energized after President Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords, other countries have been working city to city, or county, province, or state to state for some time. Indeed, if one were being unkind, it is possible to argue that some of these new networks duplicated effort and reinvented systems that already existed. This is evidenced by the number of diplomats and organizations who reported they have worked on issues including the environment and climate change through their own long-standing subnational channels. For example, regional cooperation in places such as Germany and France has been going on for years, and not just through the European Union. So while there's a great desire to make claims for this activity as the vanguard of resistance in the dystopian Trumpian world, 2016 was not the dawn of the age of subnationals doing it for themselves, but I suggest part of a much longer, deeper, almost seismic trend in the development of the entity of the state. Second, and linked to California's innovation brand, is the assertion that state is at the forefront of subnational diplomacy. Again, the reality seems more complicated. I talked to diplomats from Mexico, Canada, and Quebec, the United Kingdom and Scotland and Wales, Germany and India, who described their country's diplomatic and subnational structures. And it was clear that many have come up with solutions that are more advanced than in the United States. I know that's not the highest of bars, but happily 2 months ago, Congressman Ted Lieu of Los Angeles County proposed an Office of Subnational Diplomacy within the State Department to address this growing area. But California still has no central point of coordination. Two examples stand out. Mexico and Canada are deeply engaged with California, but not just California. Their reach includes many US states. However, they both indicated they had learned a great deal during the recent renegotiation of NAFTA, a process that tested their state-to-state and province-to-state relations. As events unfolded, they realized that they needed new channels of communication, and so they restructured not only the coordination between consulates within the state, but between consulates and the embassies in Washington and between consulates back to their home capitals. In effect, it became an opportunity for a 360-degree review in pursuit of a system that not only empowered diplomats on the ground across the United States, but also back at home to bring together in an overall strategy, an instructive lesson for California in terms of building new structures for subnational action. So California has a great deal to learn from an economic powerhouse like Ontario or a cultural center like Quebec. Perhaps there's even more to learn from countries like Wales and Scotland, which are currently evolving their subnational identities, with the blessing but not always without challenge from the center. Michael Keating has suggested that the United Kingdom is now the most plurinational democracy in the world, though I am sure India would point to the fact they are, and I quote, unshackling their domestic states to enable them to act more freely on the international stage. This leads me directly to my third two-part observation. The first part is what I heard as a clear desire from the diplomatic corps for a California infrastructure that is built to purpose. However, and as they pointed out, such a structure is only possible when the purpose is clear. I don't want to put any diplomat on the spot, but there's no need, as there was a very broad sense that California does not have a clear international strategy, does not really use the consuls effectively, and has not to date been clear as to the state's priorities with or towards other countries, and has not thought through its vast soft power capacity. Practically speaking, I repeatedly heard there was not enough resource or support for international activities, either at home or abroad, and while the efforts, particularly of Governor Brown's office at the time, were warmly welcomed and praised on the issue of sustainability, many felt there was not enough delegation of responsibility or senior staff to deal with ongoing relationship building or the protocol demands. Interestingly, this was mirrored in my interview with Governor Brown, who was clear that his international strategy was the result of a razor-sharp focus on what he called the local essence of the state's need to deliver. To invert the old adage, think global, act local, he was all about deliver local, get global help. This leads me to my final observation and a question, both related to strategy. As the fifth largest economy, California has enough clout to take positions with the same credibility as countries generally called middle powers, such as Canada or perhaps a post-Brexit UK. Further, as a recent briefing from Roland Paris from Chatham House in London suggests, these middle powers could and should help save the liberal order, as superpowers such as the United States, China, and Russia busily undermine those institutions. In that vein, one British diplomat made an interesting comparison of the United Kingdom as the California of Europe, based on the notion that neither California nor the UK have ever been truly contained by or entirely comfortable in their respective unions. Yet they share a great deal in terms of global interests, population, diversity of industry, economy, and GDP. After all, it was the UK that California knocked out to move into fifth place. Perhaps there's a new special relationship to be forged from the European West Coast to the American West Coast, with two new middle powers on a mission to improve the world, while at the same time sharing a need to avoid the national level, learning from Scotland and Wales how to be within a larger union while asserting an international profile and creating an effective diplomatic corps and presence. The idea of California taking up a role as more of a middle power, of course, leads back to the question of when do subnational relations at the international level become a foreign policy? When should a state, assuming we can agree on some kind of patchwork version of nation-state like California, claim an issue to be the equivalent of a national interest? As mentioned, Governor Newsom recently went to El Salvador on a fact-finding mission. At the end of his trip, he offered to talk up the country to business people at home, but the surprise trip seemed primarily designed to strike a blow at the White House. This raised the question from many sides, what was the point? Was there a strategy? Do we have a long-term strategy, and what is it? But I don't want to pick on the new governor, and as one former state official observed, that while Governor Brown had a strategy, its singular focus on climate change raised concerns, because, and I quote, the issue of the environment is not a foreign policy. And they felt using one issue as the defining test could put California in a weaker position on other issues. There are very real limits on California's ability to head off in a new policy direction on the international stage. But the surge of international activity testifies there's much to be gained by connecting different actors at different levels in pursuit of specific targets and goals. It's my argument that a truly global approach would make those connections clear within an overt strategy and should be supported with a permanent infrastructure. My diplomatic interlocutors made a number of practical suggestions, ranging from the very basic, such as a welcome pack for new consuls, or more trips from Sacramento officials to San Francisco and Los Angeles, particularly Los Angeles, the largest diplomatic community outside New York. But the underlying theme was a plea for a clear multi-level strategy so they can more effectively represent their countries to the state of California. From my research, I see three potential areas of work. First, and as hard as I know it would be, we need a new department to oversee this work and to create a cadre of professional California diplomats to operate strategically placed overseas offices, i.e. not just consultants and not just in pet issue-driven locations. We might start with a network of working honorary consuls. Second, and to address the local global nested sovereignties within a state, I would ensure tribal representation in this new international infrastructure. We have recognized tribes as governments. We should follow through and honor that by treating them as we do consuls and embassies, except that they have the access and support befitting their status as domestic dependent nations. I also agree with the proposal from tribal organizations that Native American economic development structures should be better connected to the state rather than operating in parallel, often they felt to the detriment of both. Our economic futures are as relentlessly connected as our checkered histories, and it's time we align them for mutual benefit. Third, and going further along our vertical axis, to be more global is to embrace the simultaneity of levels, and so it must also mean being more local to include cities and counties. The National League of Cities would like to see a federal level agency for municipalities. This seems unlikely in the current climate, but if California wants to be truly innovative, they should recognize and help manage the growing international activity at these levels. Los Angeles has a relatively new deputy mayor of international affairs. San Francisco now hosts full ambassadors tasked with representing issues to Silicon Valley. And San Diego has created a shared economic zone with Mexico. There is talk of reopening the trade office in Mexico City, and GoBiz has expanded their international affairs team. All exciting initiatives, but I suggest we also need a little old-fashioned hierarchy to ensure that the many faces of California are coordinated and supported by a state infrastructure. That said, an infrastructure means little if it doesn't have a strategy that understands that to be global is not merely an economic trade or investment task, but an attitude and overall approach that not only links but intertwines the economic with the political and the cultural, the local and the global. The goal must be to represent the interests and issues of all of California to domestic and foreign sovereigns while delegating authority to the level best equipped to address a given issue. Globalization has enabled a single person on Facebook to participate in an international campaign. Tribes around the world join together to lobby the United Nations and demand that national governments create implementation mechanisms for the UN Declaration. Counties and cities share best practice that results in policies, particularly on climate change. Every level is engaging with every other level. We are all connected. This makes it inevitable that a state with economic weight, diverse history, population, and sheer size of California is able to command a kind of state-nation status, even if our inescapable diversity prevents us from claiming the more emotive nation-state. However, what we do from this point will determine whether we are going to be only symbolically international, engaging when we want to make a Pyrrhic point against some other level of government, or if we're going to be truly innovative and create a structure necessary to connect the local and the global to build a California for all. There's a line from an Eagles song, The Last Resort, appropriately from the album Hotel California. It keeps running through my head. Who will provide the grand design? Because there is no more new frontier. We have got to make it here. And that is what it boils down to, isn't it? Becoming a truly global California is more important than some academic question. We are a microcosm of the United States and the world. We have it all. The aspiration and the perspiration, the grandeur and the grit, the majesty and the tragedy. Melting pot, tossed salad, mosaic, whatever you want to call it, our truest connection is our diversity, and global is the only identity that is big enough to capture who we are and who we can be. But the mantra of diversity good is not enough to carry us through these times. To be successful, we require a strong vertical connection of respect, understanding, and discipline along that entire axis between all the different levels, all our sovereigns in every community. That is the only way to create a robust local global citizenship and to turn California's state-nation vision of unity from diversity into a reality. We have no more frontier. We have got to make it here. Thank you.
Folks, we have some time for some questions from the audience, if you'd like. I'll walk around with the microphone to you, or if you'd like to stand or raise your hand.
Silence.
Good. Oh, good.
I think the obstacle, I hope our panelists will talk about the obstacles. The first one I can tell you that would be the most obvious obstacle is lack of political will. I think that historically and across the United States, different states have governors who have embraced more or less being international. Sometimes they've handed it off to their lieutenant governor, but there's no consistent way of doing it. And I think that one of the biggest obstacles is California's really big, but I think that there are lots of other countries and other states to learn from. But somebody will complain about money, I'm sure. Somebody will complain about how do you coordinate, and this is like herding cats. So how do you get everybody to play ball? I think that I hope our panelists will address obstacles, because I'm sure it's a lot longer than I would be most equipped to tell you.
I was wondering a lot of information, but when you talked about subnational identities and you referred to Scotland and Wales, can you expand on that a little bit and how it would relate to California?
How long have you got? Yeah, how long do we make this lesson? What is wonderful about the United Kingdom, it is exactly what it says on the tin. They are a union of kingdoms. And so when Scotland, who has been secessionist for generations now, has continually tried to renegotiate that relationship. Ireland obviously left, but Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, but particularly Wales and Scotland, have been evolving since devolution around 1997, 1998. They have been given a new constitutional structure, and that new constitutional structure has created this very interesting development of how they're going to represent those sub-national entities, which is why they don't have consuls general, but they have people who would be ambassadors if they were separate countries. So they have diplomats, but they aren't necessarily in the consul general consulate system. Does that make sense? Their title is slightly different, but they have been, and actually provinces in Canada, I think similarly, have been interesting parallel structures. Obviously the constitutions are different, but I think what they have learned about trying to be within but separate has been a really instructive lesson when you chat to the folks from Wales and Scotland about how you don't kind of piss off the national government, but also how you try and represent your own interests and how you try and make that a win-win without it being a kind of a constant fight. You don't have to like annoy the national government all the time to actually get what you need. And I think that that's the way our system is much more adversarial may not be the right answer. So that's why I'm thinking that might be a good place for us to learn about how subnationals have done it in different places, even with a slightly different constitutional structure. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Oh,
Sure. Like how you said, for our systems, like much more adversarial, do you think versus like Scotland and Wales, because of our diversity, like the issue that would present of like kind of trying to transplant that in California?
it's a good question. I think
Allison, I'm sorry, would you mind speaking into the
sorry.
microphone? Thank
It's
you.
just that light's so bright.
You can take it out
I'm
if you
just
want.
happy to get away from the light. I think that it's a good question, and it's one that they are still learning, and I think California is further behind them on the road of learning about how to do it. Because we haven't tried to do it that way, because our constitutions are just different. There's no reason why we should have tried to do it that way. But I think that there's interesting things that we can learn from how you try and, as I say, make it beneficial for everybody, rather than trying to pick fights. Like there are ways to do this that I think aren't necessarily, they're more diplomatic, shall we say, if that's not too bad a pun.
Over here.
Several years ago, just before his death, Ben Barber wrote a book entitled What Would It Be Like or If the Mayors Ruled the World? And he followed it up just before his death with the discussion that you mentioned of their cooperation on global warming. Actually, it's gone quite far, their cooperation, and sociologists have identified world cities as a geographic force in the world. What would your plan do with this new reality? It's really an old reality back to the nation or to the city-state that seems to be evolving in the growth of world cities and their cooperation.
Several points. City diplomacy in my field is a super sexy topic right now. I haven't been pursuing it myself, but I do know the area of research that you are referring to that has grown a lot in recent times, not least because of global cities, which makes sense, right? Cities, mayors are directly on the ground with the issues, delivering for people, and they see the implications of rising tides or pollution or whatever, and they have to deal with it immediately. It's not sort of remote either from the state or the nation state level. I think the problem is, I'm from Humboldt County. Bully for you on your state nation, your city state. I'm out in the sticks, folks. So they don't cover everybody. We're not in a world where that will cover other people. And so I think the state, as we understand it right now, the California level of state is a great place that's small enough but big enough to actually have some kind of ability to muster some of this coordination and these forces. I think the problem of living through great change is you got to live through the great change. And even if the nation state as we understand it is about to implode, and that may be. We had it long before we had the nation state. There were other ways that we governed the world, city-states being one of them. So I have no notion that somehow the nation state is so precious we must preserve it at all costs. But you still have to live through the fact that while the nation state blows up, there's a whole bunch of mess that happens in that wake. And so I think that, particularly as California is so large, finding a way to help coordinate those different levels might be an excellent place for us to try and focus our attention. Sure, we could let San Francisco and Los Angeles and all the other global cities, London, Paris, whatever, go off on their merry way, but that won't help Humboldt County. So I fear for what that ends up. It didn't end well last time we had city-states, I'm just saying. It didn't work out so great. So I think trying to find what evolves, and this is one of my big themes, is what does global actually mean? Saying post-global or post-constructivist or post-anything just means it came after that phase. And I think that we have to work out what we want to build that phase to look like instead of just keep saying, well, it's post-state politics. It's like, okay, well, what is that going to look like for us? Does that make sense?
Thank you. That segues into my question, kind of. I spend a lot of time in what I call the state of Jefferson. And, that includes central and parts of southern Oregon and stuff. So in your research or these conversations, did you look at the idea of nation states or the Pacific Northwest or neighboring Southwest or nation region, or not just California, but something more like a trend, or would that come up?
If it blows up, it all blows up. Well, it's I didn't do that specifically, but I guess what my field does is subnational diplomacy is different from what they call paradiplomacy. Technically, here's a technical term for you. Subnational is just anything below the national, but paradiplomacy often has the implication of being secessionist. So, for example, Scotland and Quebec would be paradiplomacy, or even proto-diplomacy. They actually want to be a separate nation state. I don't think California is yet a proto-diplomatic actor. I think we are a subnational actor. I think the state of Jefferson, apart from being a joke in Humboldt, is trying to break away within the nation-state structure that we have, but they want to be a separate state. And I think that's because the interests, they have a point, the rural interests of that part of the world are not well represented. And I think that it's a tragedy, and I think that the state of Jefferson are part of that identification of that tragedy. And I think you get more of that. That's why I think this has a huge potential for being incredibly divisive. And that's what the sovereignty, the fact, sovereignty is all over their website. And what's fascinating to me is like, these are people from the backwoods of Oregon who are like, sovereignty, I want sovereignty. That's a very weird academic word to be calling down as your reason, your basis of existence. And I think we don't pay attention to that at our peril, because the fragmentation that can create is dangerous. For a very diverse state like California, that identity sovereign type politics is kind of blowing up our country. And I think we really have to understand what that could do to us if we don't understand how to be diverse and unified. And I think the state of Jefferson is what you get. And I think that's dangerous. I was just reading the ethnic studies mandatory education. It's about to, the response is this week. From my point of view, I'm not sure that's the right answer. I don't think that's necessarily going to solve what I'm talking about. I would say intercultural communication. I teach international studies, right? It's like these cultures came from somewhere. Like we're trying to divorce it in the United States as if they didn't actually come from another country. You can't teach it as if it just sprang out of the ground in California or Texas or Arizona. They actually came from another part of the world. And I think that to not understand that, to put it in ethnic studies as if it's somehow the American experience is so unique and special is wrong. I think it's very American-centric in a way that I don't think helps us be more global. I think that the global answer to that initiative is to say you need intercultural communication and world history and world understanding. You don't need to go deeper into divisiveness. That's my political pitch for the day.
Folks, we're going to transition to our panel discussion in about 10 minutes. So we're going to take a break, but until then, please give Dr. Allison Holmes a round of applause. Folks, we're going to begin again with our panel discussion element of our presentation today. Some introductions for our panel today. To the far right over there is Douglas Smurr. Douglas Smurr is of counsel in the commercial litigation, business transactions, banking and finance, international and government regulatory administrative law practice groups at Gordon & Reeves. For over 25 years, he's been practicing international business. He's a practicing international business attorney with a diverse litigation and transaction practice based in the U.S., Latin America, and Europe. Besides his vast business litigation and transaction work, his practice also focuses on structuring complex multi-party corporate and joint venture business entities, NAFTA, trademarks and copyrights, appellate matters, and diplomatic law. Since 2008, Mr. Smurr has maintained an active cannabis practice and currently represents the largest cannabis entity in the U.S. and represents clients in various states in the hemp, medicinal, and adult use sectors. He has served in the administration of then Governor Gray Davis as the Managing Director of the Americas for the California Office of Trade and Investment in Mexico City. In this capacity, he promoted and protected the interests of California throughout Mexico, Central America, and South America. Additionally, he has served as a professor teaching Introduction to International Business at Georgetown and UCLA. Mr. Smurr holds a BA in International Relations from UC Davis, a JD with an emphasis in international trade and business transactions from McGeorge School of Law, and an MA in the Global Masters of Arts programs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Let's give him a round of applause. I'll introduce each candidate first, and then we'll each panelist. They're all voting for you. Vote for their attention, right? And then we'll go into discussion afterwards. To his left is Anka Lee. Anka Lee has 15 years of experience working at the intersection of international politics and strategy, business, and media. Currently advising California Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon on global affairs. He is helping to position California to lead on key issues of local and global significance. Prior, he was a senior director at Albright Stonebridge Group, a Washington, D.C.-based global strategy firm where he advised former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former National Security Advisor Samuel Berger, and former Secretary of Commerce Carlos Gutierrez on developments in East Asia. His work in international affairs includes stints as an intelligence analyst, studying the security dynamics in the Asia-Pacific for the U.S. military, as a congressional staffer advising members on human rights and the rule of law issues in China, and as a journalist covering democratic movements and politics in Asia. Before working in foreign affairs, Mr. Lee was a political reporter in California and served as a legislative aide at the California legislature. He is a graduate of UC Berkeley and Harvard University and is a fellow and former co-lead of the Asia Expert Group at the Truman National Security Project. Anka Lee. And last but certainly not least, Jamie Callahan. Jamie Callahan is the Deputy Cabinet Secretary in the Office of Governor Gavin Newsom. In this position, she oversees executive branch operations focused on K-12 education, labor and workforce development, and international affairs. Previously, Jamie served as the Director of External Affairs in the Office of Governor Brown, overseeing the conception, planning, and execution of all major events for the governor, including the State of the State Address, key bill signings, and visits with foreign dignitaries. She also directed the governor's international portfolio. She helped to devise and strengthen several of Brown's signature climate initiatives, including the Under 2 Coalition and the U.S. Climate Alliance, and served as Chief Executive Officer of the Global Climate Action Summit, which brought several thousand people to San Francisco over 3 days in September 2018 to spur climate leadership around the world. Callahan serves on the California K-12 High-Speed Network Advisory Board, working to bring better connectivity to K-12 schools in California, and serves as a member of the California Exposition Park and Science Center Board. She holds a master's degree in public policy from the George Mason School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs, and a Bachelor of Arts degrees in politics from the Catholic University of America. She's a native of the great state of New Jersey, but we're glad to have her in California. Please welcome Jamie Callahan. So we'll start with a response from our panelists, their insight into this topic, as well as their reflections on Dr. Holmes's research, and we'll start with Douglas. Douglas. Oh, and there's a microphone there for you to use too.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian, and I want to thank everyone for being here this afternoon. I'm going to speak to the maybe portion of Allison's presentation when she was talking about, is California going to be innovative? And as Allison was alluding to, California is at a critical juncture if it wishes to create an international agency. The question is, will California take advantage of this golden opportunity that is before it? Last week, I prepared my remarks for today, and I thought I was all ready to go. Then yesterday, something happened forcing me to rewrite everything. 15 years ago today, I authored an article entitled California Adrift Internationally, Resetting Course for the 21st Century, that chronicled the complicated 45-year history of California's past international programs, discussing what worked and what did not, attempting to understand why at the end of 2003, California zeroed out the entire cabinet-level technology, trade, and commerce agency that employed nearly 400 individuals containing 120 programs, including all 12 of its foreign offices. My findings were that two very strong undercurrents caused the implosion of the Technology, Trade, and Commerce Agency. One, that public funds should not be used to promote international programs. And two, what really concerned me was the belief that California did not need an international presence. Upon reviewing the work done by Allison and talking to her over the phone regarding her research, we both sadly concluded that in the intervening 15 years, not much had really changed, that California was lurching along without a coordinated, strategically oriented program, and that these two undercurrents were still holding sway over California, though efforts of change were gaining steam. But we are in Sacramento, and we are in the last few days of the legislative session, where anything can and does happen, right? So just before going to bed at 12:30 a.m. on Monday night, Tuesday morning, boom, I get this email notification from the California legislature advising me that SB 738, Ben Hueso's bill to establish an office in Mexico, had just been amended. To me, there were two very important changes made to SB 738. So needless to say, I did not go to bed until, well, sometime later that morning. Number one, for the first time since the last century, a bill was now proposing the use of public funds to establish an international office. So this was big. The amended version of SB 738 would also use private sector funds. Obviously, the devil will be in the details between the ratio of public versus private funding, because in my opinion, to make such an undertaking sustainable, at least 90% of the funds need to come from the general fund, that is public funds. For if the percentage is less than 90%, using private monies to fund government activities leads to serious conflicts of interest and creates problems. But at the same time, such an office needs access to private funds, because state law prohibits the use of public funds to host events such like the event we are enjoying today. Second, as amended, SB 738 allows the director of GoBiz to create an advisory board to provide guidance and develop a strategy to the success of the program. This is crucial because an advisory board will allow all of the key stakeholders to talk to one another, something they can't always do during the legislative process. So this will give everyone the time and the space to work together in creating a coordinated and strategic program that can distinguish California for years to come. Just to give you an idea of the stakeholders, including, among others, would be the governor's office, the lieutenant governor's office, GoBiz, the Senate, the Speaker's office, the California Chamber of Commerce, the University of California, La Casa de California in Mexico, the state universities, and the junior colleges of California, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, Cal EPA, Cal Energy Commission, Visit California, and of course you, the public. Historically, since the founding of the California Republic, California and Mexico have had a complicated and at times difficult relationship. Fortunately, however, over time, our shared bonds have grown stronger and the wise-hearted have prevailed. 20 years ago, Governor Davis and his Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Michael Flores, appointed me as director of the California office in Mexico City to repair the damage to the California-Mexico relationship caused by Governor Wilson and his infamous Proposition 187. Currently, Mexico is facing a similar threat, but today at a national level that emanates from Washington and the White House. And Mexico is turning to and is most grateful to its friend and ally California, because California has learned from the past. As the late great ex-state librarian emeritus Kevin Starr so correctly and eloquently stated, into California has come the human, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural richness of the planet itself. There is no people, no race, no culture, no linguistic tradition that is not in some way represented in California. In the face of the constant tweets and language bombarding us from Washington, D.C., Governor Newsom has been a beacon of wise-heartedness by proudly declaring, "We celebrate our diversity and embrace the future." And in a fitting quote that he made to New York Magazine back in October of 2018, he said, "What makes us great? At our best, we celebrate our diversity. As California, we really are a nation state." But all of California has to do its part. We cannot idly stand by if California wants to continue attracting the best of what the world has to offer. California needs to bring the best of California to the world. It is in California's own best interest to have a strategic and robust international program. Let's make this happen, and let's not miss this golden opportunity and let it slip away. So thank you, Allison, for your extremely timely research and presentation, my fellow panelists, Anka and Jamie. And thank you, Brian, and the Center for the California Studies at Sac State for putting this important event together. And of course, thank you, the public, who will keep this belief moving and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug and Allison. Thank you so much for inviting me, and also to Brian for putting this together. This is a very important conversation. I do think this is the time to have it, including even you hear themes of these discussions in our current presidential debate. There is no shortage of governors and mayors running for the highest office. So the idea and the theme of subnational engagement at the global level is certainly right ahead of us. I've actually probably spent the least time in Sacramento on this table here. I just came back 2 years ago, so I'm still learning how the city works. But I do think that there is a certain advantage of coming in from the outside. And having spent about 12 years working in international affairs and foreign policy, and seeing sort of how these abstract conversations are felt and understood at home at the ground level, is particularly helpful for anybody doing foreign policy. It cannot be an abstract conversation, it has to be grounded. So this has been a valuable learning experience for me. It's interesting, 11 years ago, actually 10 years ago, I was a reporter for Time magazine in Hong Kong, covering democracy activists. And I've sort of kept in touch with a lot of them since then, and some have gone to jail, some have been pushing ahead in the last couple of years. And it's no surprise to anyone here that we are stepping into a very uncertain world of questions of identity, of where we belong, how we fit in a global engagement process. What is the nature of Chinese rule in the future versus a liberal democratic order around the world? And so we are stepping into a very interesting moment, but also a very fraught moment that without a strategy to engage, I'm afraid it could be very tricky and messy. And I totally agree with Allison's point that we need to get our act together. So I came home in 2017 after the election and wanted to take a break from Washington, and was talking to a number of people, including Jamie, about opportunities in Sacramento, hoping to actually do something different. somehow ended up getting connected to the Speaker's office, you might wonder, what exactly is the California legislature doing with international work? How does it work? And so I would say on a good day, 95% of my time is herding cats, and on a bad day, 100% of my time is herding cats. But I do think that at its best, in all seriousness, the legislature, and Congress for that matter, at the national level, when it's acting at its best, is really a platform for the expression of our diverse interests across the state, where voices from different parts of the state, a diverse state, are heard. And we can marshal and leverage all those voices is where sort of the public can be brought into a global engagement process more effectively that way. And to do it effectively, you have to have the legislature buy in. That's how you have democratic buy-in. And so for the last 2 years, I've been working with the Speaker very closely to figure out how do we engage from a legislature side in a more effective way? How do we make sure that what we do, how do we highlight California's global thought leadership and policy priorities in a way that is coordinated? How do we step away from just doing gifts and trips and ceremonial visits and actually have serious policy conversation? And so that's been my job for the last 2 years, trying to build that platform. And it's been really exciting in the sense that we have developed some interesting initiatives. We, for the first time, have a California-Mexico strategic dialogue for legislators. We've been working very closely on an issue at the border between Tijuana and San Diego. And so our legislators are able to kind of get involved in the discussion and actually get some of the local views and interests represented on a very important issue. And also to demonstrate that international conversation is not an abstract conversation, but it is a very grounded conversation that actually impact communities who live in our state, San Diego, and bordering regions. So that's one example. We're having discussions and have established initiatives with Canada on the future of work, with the European Union and Germany in particular on data privacy. How do you have to have these conversations, because how do you regulate things jurisdictionally when they're global in nature? You can't. You can't. And so we have to get our leaders thinking more globally, even while they're acting locally and statewide policy-wise. And I'll make a point here why the legislators are great and are actually appropriate leaders to be doing this conversation, because they are grounded. They understand how their communities work. They know what their interests are. In 2016, when we had the conversation on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I was in Washington, and we had said, and I had been in a number of rooms that had these conversations about the TPP being a multinational, high-standard trade regime that is meant to harmonize trade rules around the world. And I don't even know what that means. And I think having a way to connect these broad, abstract ideas in a way that makes sense to people is what we got to do, because the key took away from the 2016 election, and this is not a profound finding, and this is only a manifestation of a long-term trend happening, is that we have, for the last generation, lost track of how to connect the global and the local, the foreign and the domestic. Communities are feeling like they are lost and drifting in space. We have a responsibility to be reconnecting with these ideas, broad and small. The legislators that I work with represent very small districts, but they're also connected to the state infrastructure. They have that perspective, and they have that desire and demand, actually, to be doing something globally that impact the local interests. So it has been a very interesting perspective. Just a couple more points here is that I do think that we need a strategy. And the executive branch should be taking a lead on these conversations. That's how I think it works from a foreign policy perspective, I think, logically. But I do think if you want it sustained, if you want it coordinated, if you want to make sure that this is going to outlast this lieutenant governor or this governor for the good of the state, you have to have legislative buy-in for all the reasons I just talked about, that it has to be sustained. And I think that's, in the same model, you have the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Washington, or the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They make sure things are carrying on from administration to administration. And I think we need to do better in the legislature, too, in the sense that we have to have a more professionalized mechanism, maybe a joint one between houses. Maybe, hey, it doesn't have to be that way, but it could be just in different houses, that will perform the same kind of duty and responsibility as our counterparts at the DC level, just to make sure that things don't get kind of pushed away to the wayside when a leader or two are gone because of elections. So that's a final point also I want to make, and having observed what's been happening here, is I do think that what we do at the state level must be consistent with our national interests. And let me just be very clear what I mean by that. Being consistent with national interests is very different from aligning with a federal policy. The Trump administration is not necessarily consistent with American national interests. This country stands for freedom, and we have certain beliefs and values, and how we treat our citizens and immigrants, how we engage the world, how we carry ourselves globally and domestically. And I think we have to be very thoughtful and consistent about making sure that we are carrying on that national interest, and also to understand that in this very complicated world, that things are happening right now, that other countries might be taking advantage of this national engagement to also try to slice and dice the United States. And I think we have to be very, very cautious about that. I have seen too many times since coming here how the conversations have gone awry. And from some of the rising challenges powers like China and others, for example, I think we have to be very, very careful. And I think you cannot do that without a strategy, without a coordinated approach, without true experts who can be actually staffing key foreign policies or some national engagement policies at the state level. You're not going to be able to have a way to do that in a way that is thoughtful, reliable, durable, but also consistent with American national interests. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'd love to have more conversation later on. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be sharing the stage with everyone here, folks that I've worked with for a while now, and someone I spent the better part of last year dodging because I was so busy and didn't have a chance to talk to her. But I'm very happy that we can share the stage today. And thank you to Brian and everyone here for organizing. I think, and would be curious, Allison, to hear too about your conversations with Governor Brown and Governor Schwarzenegger, and I think he's Governor Wilson. I think and Doug, you talked a little bit about this too, the foreign affairs has a real personality of the governor that's sort of leading the state at that time. I wasn't in California at the time, but I understand, from Governor Schwarzenegger's administration very much had the benefit of having a celebrity governor that was able to travel the world, have a big presence, spend a lot of time visiting our major trade partners, really focused on trade and economic development in a big way. And then, Governor Brown, who definitely has a very different reputation. He would travel with no staff if he was allowed to. And I think, as mentioned earlier, really saw talking about climate change on the international stage as his role internationally, and seeing that that's an issue beyond California's borders and something that we have, we have only one planet and we need to protect it. And being that California is such a leader in that space, that was really what we were able to both politically and somewhat philosophically export around the world. I was fortunate to work for Governor Brown throughout his 2 terms, but also serve in this capacity as Director of External Affairs, both pre and post President Trump, which really changed a lot of what we did and how we engaged internationally. I would say, very much focused on, continuing to build some of the coalitions that both Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Brown had started, working with other states, working with, national governments, but being a little focused on that, not kind of everybody. And then, post-President Trump, that really changed. And I know Anka and I have talked about this as well. In California, we really saw a lot of incoming from national governments around the world. I think some has good intentions, sometimes some doesn't. But it really changed for us both the capacity that we had to respond to that, so needing to have additional staff and have a little bit more of a strategy around how to engage there. For Governor Brown, that was really focused, continuing his work on climate. And that, as Allison mentioned earlier, was really the focus of all of our international agreements and the work that we were doing, around the world. And it was interesting, too, just to sort of have the interaction both with the Obama administration and then with the Trump administration to some extent. We kind of had to stay in our state place, in our state roles in the Obama administration, and the Trump administration somewhat left us alone in this international space, which is very strange. But, it was a lot of things shifted, obviously, around the country and in the world. But I think for me in my position at the time, that was, really one of the biggest changes between the, first 2 years of Brown's second term and the last two. But then, really coming to where we are today, the international affairs, that we're leading under Governor Newsom also has changed and has a different personality based on what he's looking for. Early on in the administration, he appointed the lieutenant governor as his representative on trade and international affairs. She's the perfect person for that job with her foreign affairs and diplomatic background. And also created this interagency committee on international affairs, which we did informally in the previous administration, but really was a way to formalize a lot of what Allison is talking about of coordination and also having some transparency there. So the committee has public meetings, has had one, we're having another one at the end of this month, that people are welcome to come and engage. It's made up primarily of the governor's cabinet and a lot of the folks that, Doug mentioned, Visit California, obviously the Lieutenant Governor's Office, GoBiz, folks like that are engaged in trade and economic development around the world. So that's been very exciting, and I think definitely in terms of the executive branch filling a need of where we are, needing to be coordinated, needing to be transparent about that work and having a venue to do that from. So been thankful for the governor and the lieutenant governor's leadership on that. We've also really expanded our team, both through partnerships with the lieutenant governor's staff and increasing our team at GoBiz by having more trade specialists and representatives that are going to be focused on different regions throughout the world, as well as the director of protocol. We, in the previous administration, had sort of our director of protocol emeritus, but now we have a person based here, so hopefully will help us respond to folks in a more diplomatic fashion. But that's really been exciting, and I think, again, really representative of personalities of the governor and the organizations that they create around them. Governor Brown had a very flat structure, very few staff. A lot of that was driven by coming into office during the financial crisis, not being able to really focus on international affairs until, close to the second term, just because of where the state was, and I think rightly is not the appropriate thing to be doing at that time. And Governor Newsom is able to sort of continue on that, but put more of a structure around it with the support of the lieutenant governor and really create, hopefully, at least for the executive branch, a central point of organization and a point where which we're able to coordinate with our colleagues both in the Senate and Assembly and then external groups as well. I think that's kind of where I'll stop and turn it over to you if you want to chat some more with us. Thank you.
So Dr. Holmes, your thoughts on what has been shared by the panel?
As I expected, their expertise is really what you should have come to listen to rather than me, because they actually know more than I will know in several lifetimes. But I think that it's interesting to hear the. It's on. Great light. I think that it does reflect a sort of it is a good moment because everybody's sort of thinking about it and has been thinking about it. And so I'm pleased that this is something that's kind of bubbling around out there. Governor conversations was a sort of specific point I took away. They were all very different but interesting. I think that Governor Schwarzenegger, you alluded to his celebrity status. I think that's true, but I also think that he just thinks internationally. I don't know if it's because he's foreign born or what his approach is, but his business life before he became governor was also very international. He was always thinking internationally about his movies and about his books and about his career, and all of that kind of stuff was always in the international space. And I think he just brought his own international space brain to the job of being governor. I would say that makes him slightly different. Governor Wilson wanted to talk about 187 a lot. Not exactly what my question was, but that's what we spent a lot of time talking about. And it was interesting to me that he sounded very old-fashioned. He was absolutely determined to say that he was international and about business and trade, but he only talked about international as business and trade. And he was also very bilateral. He was very kind of Cold War. I don't know how to describe it except to say he was very, my relationship with the world is my California to X, California to Y. It didn't have the interconnectedness that I think when you hear a really more global politician talk, you actually hear how they see that all of these things, you don't just pull this string and that's going to somehow do one thing. If you really are global, you understand you pull that string and about 4,000 other things suddenly come attached to it. And I think that that's the sort of difference between a kind of an old-fashioned kind of international perspective versus a globally interconnected perspective. Governor Brown, I alluded to in my talk, which was, I guess for me, I went into it with my own prejudice, which is like, if you're environmental, like you're really global and connected and cosmopolitan, and that's not his take. And I was fascinated by just how locally minded his global perspective was. It's like, I am delivering for the people of California. That is my job. I deliver for the people of California. The fact I need California to help me deliver for the people of California is kind of it's not my goal to go engage with China. My goal is to deliver for the people of California. And it wasn't the sort of, I don't know, Jesuit, cosmopolitan, philosophical perspective I was sort of expecting. And so it was an interesting check on my own sort of prejudices about what people's, in Humboldt we're very environmentally cool and social and whatever, and so we all think that that's really, and so I should know better because we're also very local. We like to think that we can talk about the environment, but actually just do it at home, and we don't have to worry about the rest of the world. We're very isolated that way, and that was kind of my experience with Governor Brown. So that's my response to the governor's conversations, which was a great honor to talk to people about what they were trying to do for the state of California. The post-Trump point, I'd also pick up on because when I talked to people like the Governors Association and the state development folks and the county folks in Washington, D.C., I was fascinated by their take on the post-Trump, and also diplomats in Washington. Embassies in Washington are hiring people to do nothing but come to states. The White House doesn't talk to them anymore. It's like, so if we don't talk to governors, we're not getting the access we used to get. So we are hiring staff in Washington to be more active so that we're tracking state houses more closely. And our consulates are giving us more reports and different kinds of reports than used to be the kind of normal traffic that would come from a consulate in some place in California or anywhere else in the United States. And that was the point I was particularly making about Mexico and Canada, was their education or re-education process as they were trying to lobby through the NAFTA process, state to state or province to state. And really what they had to do is an education exercise, because most governors in the United States don't have a clue what's actually that, because it's not their job. Constitutionally speaking, most governors are not tuned into those trade and investment issues and what NAFTA did or did not do for them. And so it was a really interesting reflection of what they felt their job had to be in that process to educate governors and then lobby governors and then get governors to go tell the president what they needed to make this work. And that's a subnational level that they felt governors had more access to the White House than either foreign diplomats in Washington. And the way to get that access to an post-Trump world was that subnational. Bizarrely, the subnational has bumped up because Trump likes to talk executive to executive. He doesn't like Congress so much because they fight with him. Whereas talking to a fellow executive officer like a governor, he feels, I guess, is sort of more akin to his job. So the post-Trump point I thought was really interesting, how those organizations, either state government association or governors or counties, felt like how they had to respond to the next level of subnational development. In the world, so that we're not so parochial, I think that subnational diplomacy, we are part of a trend of creating an infrastructure for subnational diplomacy. We're not the only ones who are suddenly going, well, how do we want the premier or the governor or the whatever developing their office of subnational interaction? And I think on that point, That's where I mean California's not ahead of that curve. But there are a lot of people who are ahead of us on that curve in terms of how do you build an infrastructure that has all the right stakeholders. That list, I gotta say, looks like the usual suspects. I don't think that that list has been revised since Doug wrote his paper 20 years ago, and I don't think that that's a good thing. I don't think that that's very subnationally sensitive to where we're at now. There's no cities, there's no counties. Like, hello, these people are out there doing deals. So I think that how we try and revise that advisory committee, should it come to pass, will be really important. I would add tribes, I really would. And I also don't think that it's just about trade and investment. And I think sustainability is not an economic issue. It's a political issue. It's a worldview issue. And if you think that all the economic issues of the world are just economics, then you're not connecting the global and the cultural and the political realities. Like, to be global is to actually understand my economic agenda is a way of framing my space. And that means it's political and cultural. What I prioritize, if I'm a tribe, what I do with fish or lumber is not an economic development issue. It's a cultural issue. And how I treat my resource is going to be different. And so understanding and respecting that part of their sovereignty has an impact on economic issues, but it's not an economic issue. And so I think if we keep pretending that somehow international is trade and investment, we've missed that global connecting point. And I guess that's why I keep coming back to the old-fashioned international trade and investment is one thing, but if you want to be global, you can't pull on that thread and think you're just going to pull one thing. It just can't work that way. But I don't know. I have no great solution. I have no silver bullet. I only have some thoughts of how woolly this thing is and how you try and wrap your head around it, if that's a response to what you guys said. But thank you very much for your comments. I think it's great that you're here.
Yes, responses to responses, yes, indeed.
Yeah, sure. Allison, I couldn't agree with you more that we can't call these, if California does establish international offices, don't label them trade and investment offices. Because when I headed up the California office, the actual trade and investment was maybe a third to maybe 20% of all the work I did. All the other work was in regards to working the political agenda, working the bilateral relations between the cities and the states and the counties, both in Mexico and here in California. So what California needs to do is it needs to play with the full deck of cards and not just trade and investment, because our relationship is much more than just trade and investment. Okay.
I think I'll just make one point, and I totally agree with where sort of the embassies and consulates are right now. I've had more than probably dozens of conversations with ambassadors in Washington, but also consuls general here in California, and there are many of them. And it always made really, sometimes they're quite frank, actually. Two main points. One is, hey, our ambassador really got burned in 2016. Direct quote from several. Because they totally didn't see this election coming in the United States. They didn't feel like they were, well, I would tell them, to be fair to you, none of us saw this coming either. But the sense that they didn't really have a good pulse of the voices of the community across the United States, how they were feeling they were either plugged in or not in a global economy, is sort of the biggest gap that they felt they had in their reporting infrastructure. So, they are absolutely, we're bombarded with requests from dozens and dozens of countries wanting to work with us constantly. But I hate to say it, we just don't have the bandwidth to reciprocate, and that's on us. My international team is housed within the protocol office in the speaker's office, and I have a very energetic team of 2, and me included. And the great Dutch want to talk about water maintenance, or the Danes want to talk about clean energy, or the Japanese want to talk about emergency preparedness and flood control. The Indians want to talk about agricultural best practices. There's only so much we can do. And that's 80 members in the assembly, right? And you got the governor's office, really applaud the staffing up, and I talked to Evan Reed, who's with the Lieutenant Governor's office, with that expertise coming in. I think it's much needed. But even then, to be really seriously doing it, and to have other countries really take us seriously as a subnational entity, and to show and demonstrate that we can actually have carry-on, sustained, continued conversation to actually mean something, we have to have the resources, the bandwidth, and the people. Right now, we just don't.
Yeah, I think just to build on all of that, it will be really interesting to see in, hopefully 2 years-ish, if there is a different administration, how that changes. I mean, do we just see this huge sort of sucking sound of everyone going back to DC and no longer kind of engaging at the same level? It'll be interesting to see, as you were talking, if the engagement that diplomats from other countries have been doing at the state and city level, if they have found benefit in that and will continue doing it, or will be engaging more on the federal side with in the sort of more traditional channels. And I think that's something I would weigh in terms of how we would staff if we were to create some sort of new thing. What would it look like in 2 years, and would it be necessary?
At this time, I'm happy to take questions from the audience of any of the panelists and Dr. Holmes as well. Hold your hand up and we'll come to you with a microphone. So, please.
Hi. So I have a question. What are some of the sort of the constitutional limitations that California has in fully expressing its, I guess you would say, its desires to become a true nation-state player?
The Constitution says no. There are some little loopy holes, which is if Congress says it's okay, then you can, but actually you're not supposed to mess with the direction. And to your point about what is the national interest of the country, that's why they want to be able to have a check on what their subnational units do. It's sort of the name is what it is on the tin, right? United States. And when we were 13 colonies, they were separate countries. So when they built that Constitution, that whole checks and balances thing was because they didn't want to get the states too uppity, but nor did they want to not have the spine of control. And so there is just a few little places. It's actually not, for the Constitution being really verbose in places, there's these little tiny pieces that states have to look to try and work out where they can eke out their little bit. Treaties is the most explicit. You cannot make treaties with other folks. That's not okay. But the long list of terms that we use for things that aren't really treaties, but kind of treaties, we just made up a bunch of other words that sort of, but they're not binding. And I think that the important part about not being binding is that for other countries, back to the infrastructure point, if we don't have a way to keep track of these things, Los Angeles is doing MOUs with other countries. Hello? How do we keep track of whether or not the states, here's back to the congressional interesting point, is no, Los Angeles, you can't do something that contravenes can it discuss, but it's better if Los Angeles knows what California is doing so that California and Los Angeles don't contravene each other or start grazing in the same field in a way that's not very helpful to either. And I think that's part of why you really need to have that vertical examination of what everybody's doing, not so that you can stop anybody per se, but so that you can actually say, well, actually that will not help what this goal is. And if you have a strategy, I think part of the answer of we can't staff everything, we can never staff everything. But if you just said, you know what, Luxembourg, you're just not in this, okay, back off. And I think that a strategy means that people know who's in and who's not. Our priorities are not just an issue. Our priorities are with certain countries or certain places or certain industries or whatever, but the strategy can shape some of that so that they stop asking, because they know they're not on the top of the list. But if you have a different tier of way of dealing with the people who aren't in the top tier, at least they know they get some service, right? The one that just seems sort of brain smart to me is a welcome pack to consuls general. Here's how the governor's office wants to interact with you. that will also triage some of what you are getting, because in fact they know that it's like, here's the usual wait list, here's who you talk to, here's how it works, and you don't have people bumping around feeling like they're just in the dark. So the constitutional point, I think, is it touches a much bigger piece, but we weren't designed for secession. The nation state is very jealous of its sovereignty, and we are not supposed to get out of that box. And and the rest of the world will not recognize it. Scotland had this challenge when they wanted to secede. The European Union said, oh, but you know what? Your European Union membership card doesn't apply. Hello, you go to the end of the queue. And they went, okay, well, maybe we won't do that then, because they wanted some of the privileges that they were given by UK state nationhood sovereignty. And they wanted to play fast and loose with how they were going to sneak past everybody else who's in the queue and get back into the European Union. It's like, no, I'm sorry, you don't get to play that card, because we don't like secession. The United Nations doesn't like secession. None of the groupings that we have that are multinational don't like secession. It is naughty behavior. So Quebec has the same problem. Spain has several issues, right?
Would you look at the sort of structures that both Quebec and Catalonia have? Because in our interaction with them, they do have a more robust sort of quasi-foreign service with quasi-consulates, and they do sort of act more like a national government.
That's back to the proto-diplomacy point,
Right.
which is if you want to be a nation state, you have a different structure. That's why I think that Quebec is not the best example. Ontario is a good example. As an economic powerhouse of North America, we don't usually think of Ontario, but Ontario is like California in that sense. It's for its country. It is a huge pillar of their economic structure. Quebec, not so much because it's secessionist. Scotland, maybe-ish, kind of, but it's also secessionist, and their diplomatic structure being built while they're pretending they're not secessionist anymore is going to be kind of interesting to see when that secessionist movement comes back yet again for another go. And I think Wales, therefore, might be more because they have no pretensions of secession. So I think, but they are creating a diplomatic corps. They are evolving towards having permanent diplomats who will be the Wales diplomat who then goes to the Bahamas or then goes to France or then goes to the United States. And I think that idea of a subnational diplomatic professional corps is an answer that may keep us under the subnational constitutional troublemaking radar, but it does mean that we actually have consistency, we have training, we have people who understand California, and I think honorary consuls are entirely legal for us. Honorary consuls are historically the oldest form of diplomat. And so you can send them anywhere you want. I think there's no my reading of the Constitution is California could do that tomorrow and we wouldn't have a problem. But that's, I'm sure Doug may have a legal view on that, but I'd send a bunch of honorary consuls right away.
Being an attorney, the legal take on it, and what we always did when I worked at the Mexico office, is you focus, as Allison was mentioning, what Governor Brown was great at, is making it a local issue. Whether it's renewable energy, whether it's environmental agreements to help clean up the San Diego area or the Sierra Cortez, or whether it's educational exchanges and setting up, for example, La Casa de California in Mexico for the University of California. Those are great examples of how and what California can and should be doing.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
I wanted to go back to the start of how small trade and investment is in this concept of international affairs, because when I look back through history, history always seems to have been around trade and investments that's created the Civil War, for example. And so for me, California right now is in a new industry, in the cannabis industry, and it's creating a lot of what I can consider a topic for the vertical strategy that you just mentioned, because we are exploding in a lot of ways of trying to become strong in this industry, and then as well as, I'm sure, internationally strong and globally. So would that be example of how history is repeating itself of why a nation is created, for example?
Wow. A very good and interesting question. I think my response to that would be, look, trade and investment is generally done through individuals and businesses, not at the state level, meaning government to government level. And there are certain instances and situations where the government does play a role and can help create that and give direction as far as where and what we want to do and what we don't want to do, and to help stop illegal practices. And I think that's the role. That's the way I see it. I don't know if anyone else in the panel would like to jump on that.
Well, I guess that suggests that marijuana would be the new big industry, but California has already got so many huge industries that are already so global. I don't see that as being the one that kind of tips us into it. It's sort of not like cotton or tobacco, historically speaking, sugar, that became this global driving thing that somehow suddenly connects us to everybody else. And there's no shortage of places to go get it, where those industries and products were primarily extractive and often in places that you could only get it, or at least at that time, you could only go get it in a certain number of places in the world. I don't think that marijuana is in that category. I'm not sure we have anything. Actually, maybe the chips in your phone that I gather are like from a place in Africa that I don't even know the name of the country. It's like, I think that might still be one of those things that everybody uses and it only comes from like one place. But I'm not sure we have that many things left that are industries that can't be replicated somehow somewhere else. So I'm not sure I see marijuana as tipping us into a different category of economic player. And we're not going to be the only broker. Canada's jumped ahead. And so they went, yep, forget all this piecemeal nonsense. We're going all national. Boom. And that's why a lot of the investment that might have come to places in the United States has fled across the border to Canada. So in terms of we didn't have a national strategy. We had a piecemeal prohibition. Alcohol might have been the comparator. It's like, ooh, we're going to stop this bad behavior. And it screwed up the economics of it. And therefore, Canada said, we're going to skip all that. And that gives them now a different mover advantage, economically speaking. We kind of messed it up, and we're continuing to mess it up. The regulation for Humboldt is, again, destroying Humboldt. We have yet another industry that is destroying a rural community because I've screwed up the regulation of it. And so all of our little local farmers, who we might have wanted to promote and help, are all being wiped out by out-of-area owners. And it's like, that's the state that just messed up an industry that might have helped a small community actually overcome the fact that forestry and fishing are going down. Everybody said, oh, marijuana's going to save us. And then the regulators came in and messed it up. So we're not very good at that foresighted thing, I guess, and it's all connected.
We have time for about one more question. Please.
I was, one of the things that hadn't been talked about that was always in my heard is the northern and southern states of California. And so if it's harder to build one nation in California, but rather break it off, is that something that's another strategy, a possibility for discussion?
Well, I don't mean to take over some steps from Jamie here, but Governor Newsom, one of the things he's focused on, and which I think, and I commend him greatly, is the disparity between the coastal California and inland California. Not just so much the north-south issue, but the coastal and the inland, because of the economic disparities that exist between the two. So I think that's another issue that should be addressed, and that this administration is working very adamantly on seeing how we can bring economic development to this area, to and including the governor's talk about, the high-speed trail in going from Merced down to Bakersfield. So I don't know if there's anything else that either of you guys want to say about the north-south or the inland and coastal.
There might have been some pressure for it, but I think now California is again the rest of them. So I don't think that anybody's thinking that the answer is, and apart from the state of Jefferson, they're still going to be doing the state of Jefferson. But I don't think that a lot of the initiatives that were about trying to break up California into different states have much traction in a post-Trump era. I sort of think that kind of said, well, the devil you know, as opposed to breaking up into pieces where we would be more easily overrun. The coastal inland thing, as I alluded to, is like, yeah, that's true, except for Northern California, and we don't understand. Like, I get it, inland in the South, but that is a north-south issue, and so the disparity, we all ain't San Diego and San Francisco, we're not. And I think that the idea of how do you address economic disadvantage shouldn't have a geographic place to it. It should have a criteria base to it of where we have disparity and lack of opportunity. I was just reading a report about 92% of the population of the Klamath Basin, which is just further north of me, are hungry. And it's like, that's often a lot of tribes, but it's a lot of other very small rural communities in that, and you can see why the state of Jefferson has the feeling that they're not being heard. 92% of the population are hungry. This is California. So I think that fragmentation tension, the more you want to try and push on that, it will mean that people want to break away or feel as if they are not being heard. And I think that that's a dangerous place to kind of not try and say, actually, how do we try and make these things feel more connected, that we actually see and hear how they are interconnected. And I think that's a really important way of trying to define whatever the strategy is that the interconnectivity of it is, I would say, the most important piece.
Moderator's discretion, I'm going to ask a question, just to be the last one. What kind of subnational activities or actions have been exercised by other states in our union that maybe we're not doing or that we could learn from as well? We're not the only state bordering another country, for sure, and we're not the only state that has a vested interest in our economic future tied into other nearby or other countries facing either ocean.
Yeah, I think it's just so hard to compare California to other states just because of the sheer size. When we work, and I'm sure the legislature experiences this as well, when we work with other states, with the exception of like New York, Texas, maybe if we worked with them, but it's the staffing, the capacity is just not the same. Yeah. So what we have found in most of the coalitions that we're a part of is we have the expertise and the staffing to really support kind of the back office of that. The political leadership is always sort of the same level, like governor to governor, but we do find we're kind of supporting more of the efforts with our, with our staff, with our expertise, especially in the climate space.
Just a little bit add to that. I think it's important to remind ourselves that we are one of 4 full-time legislatures in the whole country, right? So, it's in the same way that Jamie talked about partnering. We have been working with other legislatures and sometimes, offering our assistance in their engagement too. And I know CSG is here, CSG West. I mean, we work with them to partner with other legislators in other states. I think that's one thing we've done, and I do think California can be a resource for other states and cities. And mayors actually, interestingly, has been really active on this front, right? So, the Ambassador Hachichian's office in LA has 7 people, I think.
The New York Mayor's Office has a number of people staffing economic development. There's a network of mayors around the country looking at climate issues that are plugged in with global climate subnational initiatives. So I do think there are some great examples, and I think California certainly, we have the ideas, we have the demand and the urge, but I do think, back to the point of our whole conversation, is we need to back it up with the infrastructure, with the seriousness, with the strategy, knowing what we are, what we care about, and really empower our leaders in the legislature and also the executive branch to shine globally. So.
Yeah, my comment would be this. Currently in Mexico, there are 23 states that have offices, that have representation in Mexico. California is not one of them. California does not have a representation, and that is what we need to change. So we need to close this loop of maybe and put a big, huge green check, yes. So that's, again, I want to thank Allison and Brian for hosting this, and thank all of you.
Yeah. Folks, let's give our panel a round of applause. And before we leave, I'd like to also thank, we put these events on a regular basis, but I'd like to thank the staff of the Center for California Studies for all their work in assembling everything in here. Let's give them a round of applause as well. This event has been recorded and will be available for broadcast and rebroadcasting purposes to be able to see at a later date. If you'd like, we'll be sending it out to everyone who replied to our Eventbrite site as well, and it'll probably be on our website also. Please stay tuned and keep your eyes on this space. In October, beginning of October, we're going to have another speaker series related to, as the topic was brought up, cannabis in California. So until then, please stay cool. Thank you very much.